Okay, so we are going to kind of start in the middle of Chapter 5, as the activity I'm having you do for the American Revolution covers the first half of the material you need to know for the test on Wednesday. And this first section that I'm actually going to go over is not something you actually need to know for the test, so if you want to fast forward through this slide, you can, but I wanted to talk about it in class, and I'm just not going to have the time to talk about it tomorrow. So the portrait you see is of Washington crossing the Delaware, and it is pretty famous, and many of you have probably seen it before, but there are a lot of discrepancies in the image that prove that this isn't actually like a posed portrait where, you know, someone painted what they saw as Washington crossed the Delaware with his troops, because there's a lot of things in here that make the actual painting kind of impossible. One, you see the American flag in the image, but the American flag did not fly during this battle. It would not fly until the following year, actually, for the first time. So we know that the flag wasn't there. Also, the boat is not accurately depicted. The actual boat that George Washington would have come over on with his troops would have had higher sides, and the boat itself is actually way too small to carry the amount of occupants that are shown in the boat. If you look at the chunks of ice, we know that it was cold in the Delaware, but ice freezes in sheets, not chunks, so that wouldn't have happened either. And then lastly, it's very unlikely that Washington would be maintaining this very statuesque pose that he is portraying, because he probably would have lost his balance. So while this is a grand image, it is likely that it didn't quite look this beautiful. Okay, before we go on to the Colonial Homefront, I want to touch a few bases that I worry that you may have not gotten in your group exercise, so that's what we'll do now. Talking about the alliance with the French during the Revolution. The colonists were in great need of allies. They definitely needed support from another country in order to defeat Britain. So it was actually Benjamin Franklin, who had who he himself was sent to France to try to get aid for the colonists. So he travels to France in efforts to get aid from the French for the colonists. And he probably felt that the French would be willing to help the colonists, because we all know that France and England were not at the best of terms at this time, so maybe they would help the colonists defeat England. But the French decided and told Franklin that they would not ally with the colonists until they proved that they could defeat the British. So the French told Franklin they will not ally with the colonists until they proved they could defeat the British. Basically, France wants to support the colonists but doesn't want to help fund a losing battle. They want to know that it's actually possible for the colonists to hold their own against England. And this is kind of the main significance that hopefully you discussed with your partner and then your quad of the Battle of Saratoga, because it is strongly considered the turning point. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of the war, because you already talked about that with your partner and your quads, but I want you to know that the significance of it for the Franco-American alliance was that this battle proved to the French that the colonists could win this war. So the Battle of Saratoga proves to the French that the colonists could win this war. So it's after this battle that the French sign an alliance with the colonists and declare war on England. And this alliance becomes known as the Franco-American alliance. Okay, and what do the French get out of this? Well, in the alliance, France was promised that they would get Canada back if the American side won. So France was promised that they would get Canada back if the American side won. Okay, we're going to move on now to our last two sections of Chapter 5, starting with the Colonial Homefront. So as we kind of addressed at the very end of class today, Homefront refers to what's happening to those who are not fighting in the war. So what is life like for the civilians, that's what we call people not fighting, during wartime, especially in America? Okay, because the war is also being fought on American soil. So what is life like for colonists on the home front not involved in actual fighting? Well, there's several factors we need to know. First of all, the economy was really, really bad. Goods were scarce. Prices were high. People were forced out of their homes to avoid battle. And there was also violence between the two groups of colonists who disagree with each other. One second. Okay, so there's more conflict between the two groups of colonists who disagree with each other, and of course known as the Patriots and Loyalists. So there's kind of violence between them. So the home front is not doing so well, even though, the war for the colonists is turning. This is a very difficult time for the civilians. Oh, and I have a few points on here. So if you want to freeze the screen now, let me go back. If you want to freeze the screen now, you can, to get those 4 bullets. Okay. So now, of course, we're going to talk about the women's perspective on the war and their contribution to the war effort. So we all kind of know the pattern of history. In times of war, while men are away fighting, women kind of have to step up to the plate to get things done in the men's absence. So during this time, from the woman's perspective, we have an increased production of cloth that the women are making themselves. Typically, the cloth would be for the soldiers' uniforms. So an increased production of homespun cloth. We have the women doing the farm work while the men are away. There are some radical women who disguise themselves as soldiers and actually fought in some of these battles for the colonists. And this is not very common, but it did happen, and the one example we know in history that we always focus on anyway during this war was Molly Pitcher. She was actually considered a hero amongst women, and George Washington actually named her a non-commissioned officer. So he kind of honored her for really stepping up to the plate in the war. Very empowering. Also, women would travel with the army, even if they weren't fighting. They would travel with the army to provide medical support and to cook. All of these things are going to hold significance because they make women feel more important and led them to expect more rights with their new government when it would be created. So it kind of empowers the women to expect more from themselves and their government. Okay, so we'll talk about Valley Forge. It is a long time where the soldiers are suffering during the war, okay, between the year of 1777 and 78. And I'll kind of give you the background of Valley Forge and why it's considered a very trying time for the colonists and the soldiers. So there was not a whole lot of money available for colonial troops. There was not a lot of money available for the troops. So they were trying to survive in very harsh conditions, particularly during the winter. It was a very, very bad winter. Because they had no supplies, thousands of them died. And by no supplies, I'm talking, basic necessities, food, materials for clothing to keep warm, any sort of remedies to treat people who are sick. So that troops are dying by the thousands. So at this time, George Washington is kind of commanding an army, and he used some of his own personal money to help the troops as they waited. This is kind of that waiting period for French assistance to arrive. He is viewed at this point, Washington is seen at this point as a hero because none of his troops deserted the army, meaning none of them fled. They stayed and suffered through the conditions of this harsh winter until help arrived from the French. So at this point, Washington really is emerging as a great leader amongst the colonists, a good role model. Okay, we're going to now move on. Here's a quote from Washington. This is him kind of pleading to the Continental Congress and to others for extra supplies. Okay, we're going to move on to our last section now, which is the path to victory in your outline. Okay, so in the late 1770s, the British side is going to want to move the war south. The reason they want to do this is because there's a large population of loyalists or Tories living in the southern colonies, so they're kind of counting on the loyalist support in the southern colonies to help them ultimately defeat the Patriots. And England is successfully able to capture Georgia, and then above that, South Carolina. So they're kind of now working from the south and going to try to move north to meet, the main colonial army and defeat the colonists, hopefully. So this brings us to the Battle of Yorktown. And Yorktown, you need to know, is in Virginia. When the British troops arrive in Virginia, Washington was able to surround them with American and French troops. So General Cornwallis, and I have his name on the slide, he is the British general, and he is forced to surrender to George Washington. So after Yorktown, support for the war in Britain, meaning back at home in England, is kind of dwindling. So England is not really happy about the cost of this war, and Parliament is kind of ready to start negotiating with the colonists and to stop the fighting, because it is exhausting their resources and their energy. So Yorktown does become the final battle of the Revolution and the ultimate determining factor for the colonists winning. So yay! Okay, this is kind of a random, ignore that. This is kind of a random side note, but we need to address it because I don't know really where else to put this in the notes. So I want to talk briefly about Benedict Arnold. It's an important name. He is actually a colonist. He was a great general at one time. He was a great general for the colonists, and he was well liked by Washington. But he gets into a lot of debt after being discharged from the military. And he marries a Tory, meaning someone with, a loyalist perspective, a Tory woman, and he becomes bitter for not getting enough credit for his work in the war. So he feels like an underappreciated colonist. So he kind of turns sides and starts helping out the British. He began selling Britain military plans. And he was supposedly going to help the British capture West Point, which was an important fort in New York. And he was also supposedly going to help the British capture George Washington, the general. But his message is intercepted due to the acts of John Andre, who, don't worry about him right now, but his message is intercepted, so he is caught, and he is forced to flee to England because the American colonists are very angry with him. But after this, Benedict Arnold does become a name you commonly associate with a traitor, because he was a traitor to the American Patriots. I know that Miss Peavy has a poster in her classroom, if you should see it sometime, where she compares Nick Saban to a Benedict Arnold, and telling him to enjoy his scarlet letter A. So if any of you Alabama sympathizers out there, okay, you know what that means. But anyway, so Benedict Arnold, important person in the Revolution. Okay. Last point here, diplomatic triumph. So we're going to see how the land is kind of broken down and what America gets as a result of them winning this war. So treaty negotiations took 2 years. It took a long time for the colonists to finally negotiate everything with England. And the treaty that officially ends the American Revolution is, as we already discussed, the Treaty of Paris, 1783. So that year is then important, so you don't get it confused with the treaty that ended the French and Indian War. So the Treaty of Paris, 1783, officially ends the American Revolution between Great Britain and America. And here's the main points you need to know about it and what it stated. Number 1, Great Britain formally recognized American independence. Great Britain formally recognized American independence. So we're officially independent from England. Number 2, Great Britain does get to keep Canada. So who's unhappy about that? France is unhappy about that because they were promised, if you remember, with the Franco-American alliance, that they would get Canada if they won. But Great Britain, at the end of the day, Great Britain gets to keep Canada. Thirdly, America gets the land, all land, east of the Mississippi River, except for the city of New Orleans, which at this time is still occupied by the Spanish. And then lastly, and this is going to be important, okay, in the future, so don't forget this point. Great Britain promised to evacuate all forts in America, meaning they promised to take out all British troops from the American continent and bring them back to England. Okay, so that is all of the notes from Chapter 5. It was short and sweet, as I promised. Come prepared tomorrow to review, and I'll kind of go over some of these key points again tomorrow, but just come prepared to review for your test on Wednesday.